start recording and start streaming again. Oh wait, no, I have to
So I've
actually
got
set
a
that.
list of things that I've been thinking about
Oh, awesome! I love that.
that we sort of touched on it last time we texted,
Mm-hmm.
uh, like sort of the themes that, you know, we're both struggling with right now.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, and so like I'd say the big trifecta is fate, free will, and destiny, you know?
Mm-hmm.
These are like perennial themes. Nobody's ever going to solve them. But I think we've both encountered some like interesting, perspectives on this over the last few months. Like we're working with them in each in interesting ways. Uh, so I did that independent study here in Switzerland on Steiner and his approach to these themes and how he sees them related to the stars. And then,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I was also studying, other approaches to fate and so forth as a part of that. Like I read Liz Green's Astrology of Fate and was getting a grip. I read Light on Light and really appreciated their section on
Oh,
the different
nice.
forms of karma.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was yeah, even been dipping into like some of the Taoist ideas about destiny or um, yeah, freedom, free
Mm-hmm.
will.
What do they
Those are
say?
those are pretty interesting.
What's their
Well,
take?
there's a couple different forms of it. There's
Mm-hmm.
they're into the idea of luck a lot, you know,
Gotcha.
and like there are a lot of forms of um, sort of like a I don't know. I think their big thing is aligning with the flow of it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So they've got like heavenly luck, which is their sort of form of astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And then they've got earthly luck, which is sort of like, uh, I guess we could call it, or I guess feng shui is a big part of that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you align with the like circuits or flows of fortune or good energy?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also then they call it human luck, which is basically like your own self-willed like um, capacity and also your sort of social um, capacity. Yeah, you're like the luck of relationships. But yeah, they
Interesting.
sort of have this view of like a life trajectory, which is like our individual flow of Tao, and it also has like they think about it very much in terms of not just like a single trajectory, but also like a duration of that trajectory. Like longevity is such a focus of Taoism,
Mm-hmm.
and then like our deviations from that path are like illness and also like shortening the duration of our life. You know,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and so they view it very much like you can think of it like a straight line, and then there's like these sort of oscillations, and those oscillations have like very real consequences,
Yeah.
you know, in terms of yeah, longevity.
Yeah. That's
So
interesting
that's a really
because
interesting one.
it's
Go ahead.
almost like it's a current of you've got a certain amount of luck or a this is relating to some of my own metaphors that I've been coming up with lately, but it's like a life valley or a life sort of structure, a
Hmm.
topography. But it sounds like in the Taoist model, it's almost like a straight line. It's almost like a strand of fate that maybe wobbles a little bit in some way.
Hmm.
Um, it's interesting because that does seem to be a lot of common components. I also recently just read the part on Light on Life that covers karma and the different types of karma,
Hmm.
and it seems like it's a very frequent thing in many systems to think, oh, this is actually like you mostly don't have free will, but if you try really hard and pay a lot of attention and do the right things, you can take advantage of where you are in life.
Hmm.
And then if you try really hard and do some really weird esoteric stuff, you can actually find, free will or self determinants or what have you.
Hmm.
I've been reading about that a lot from Gurdjieff stuff lately. Are you familiar with much of his work?
No, definitely not on the. I mean, I guess I understand his conception of like humans being mostly robots,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and we have to like try really hard not to be robots.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but
Yeah.
that's about it. I
Exactly.
don't. Yeah, and I saw your post about his sort of like more deterministic leanings, but I didn't I didn't like pay a ton of attention or dig really
Yeah,
dig into
so
it.
Gurdjieff has this entire mathematical model where he covers the different types of essentially the different levels of evolutionary consciousness, I guess. He has an idea of emanations, essentially. It's kind of like Kabbalistic emanation theory, but he relates it to number theory, where he's like, okay, well, the absolute divine is one, and then when you subdivide that, you get three, because his entire theory is based around the number nine. So you've got threes and nines and sixes, but then you also have doublings, so you go from like 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, and it's hard to describe because like these numbers basically map to his version of the world in a very abstract way. I've got ISOM around here somewhere. Let me just show it to you because that's probably the quickest
It's
way.
sort of, I mean, in some ways, it reminds me of some of the things of Taoism. You know, like they've got like the Tao, the
Oh,
singular
really?
Tao,
Interesting.
and then they've got like sort of breakdowns of that, and all those, you know, that's mapped onto the I Ching, and it's also sort of like the breakdown that then comes to like recompose into the human being. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they've got a sort of mathematical, and then I guess there's also uh, like the Kabbalistic, you know, perspective of like there's very much like the tree of life. You know, they've got a sort of mathematical breakdown of the different.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about, though.
It's pretty close. I would say that Gurdjieff and the Kabbalistic tree of life have some similarities in terms of kind of like levels and ranking and numerology, but I would say that Gurdjieff's attachment of numbers to things is a little bit more. It's almost like abstract. It's more like a framework as opposed to. Well, I don't know. He speaks about it in a very literal way, but I have no way to engage with it except in a way that's abstract. So, for instance,
Mhm.
he is this right side for you or is this reversed?
I can read it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So like up here, you've got one, I think, being the absolute. Then you have three being I haven't actually read. Okay, all worlds, all suns, then just the sun, and then I think we have all planets, Earth, and then the moon, and then finally we have the absolute again because the absolute is within everything essentially. So he's like, as you get all the way down to the bottom, it's just the absolute again. And so he has
Mhm.
this interesting number system of like 1, 3, yeah, 1, 3, 6, 12, 24, 48, and 96 in the way that it works. And it's all kind of this weird, specific esoteric number theory to what he does with the Enneagram, with the Enneagram
Mhm.
being kind of this circular loop. And it's interesting because, like, Gurdjieff essentially states that the Enneagram, the original diagram of, the 1 through 9 that goes like, I don't know how it goes exactly, something like that. It's kind of
Yeah.
like, looks like the bat. And his idea is that this is actually just a 2D representation of a process that happens in 3D space. And as you go through this circuit, it really is representing a evolutionary model where you're moving through these periods of resistance points. So a lot of Gurdjieff's theory is that we have this idea of octaves, which in reality, like, or what people often do musically is they just treat the octaves as if they're all just notes on a scale, right? And we just
Mhm.
happen to not have a B sharp. It's just C, right? Go to B to C, E to F, and then all the other notes have half notes in between. What Gurdjieff points out is this is actually the due to the fact that in terms of the core structure of, like, I guess reality, he's saying that between the B and C you can and E and F you can find a principle where it actually takes a greater energy jump to cross the gap between the second and third number in the Enneagram and the seventh and the eighth. So he maps his Enneagram onto the Tolfa scale essentially, and his idea is that this amount of energy jumps is essentially what enables reality to become more complex because it is the model of evolution by which you either jump into the next cycle of nine or you devolve into the lower one. So he's saying that
Mm.
as you go around, you're actually spiraling up or you're spiraling down. And Patrick Watson actually made a connection to the. I think I posted something about it, and Godel Escher and Bach, relating to the idea of like these strange loops, that recurse in on themselves and gain consciousness or a form of consciousness as a result of the pattern they create. And like he actually pointed out that, if you visualize all the planets and the solar system moving through space, it's really like the sun and the earth are just actually moving forward through time, right? Like forward through space at the same time, because we're actually moving through space. So in a literal sense, the motion that can be described by the Enneagram in terms of like this upward or downward spiral is literally happening in space with all the planets at this moment. So I've been very into these kind of like analogies and rhymes that I've been finding between these ideas from disparate places. And I'm right now reading, like, I'm just starting to get into this freaking monster of a book.
Yeah.
That's my bookmark right there.
Yeah. Bertolt Escherbach.
Yeah, exactly. This one. And like it's essentially about how mathematical formulas and proofs, like I think the idea that's saying is that every single mathematical formula or proof, or maybe within a certain context, is limited, is despite being proven by, I think, Principia Mathematica to be non-self-referential, and this is the topic that I'm getting into with this book eventually, is that every proof in that book actually is self-referential because of the fact that it's attempting not to be self-referential. And then he relates this to a bunch of other stuff. Like he's like, this has impacts in music, it has impacts in philosophy, it has impacts in biology, it has impacts in everything. And this is, I think this is the Strange Loop guy, so I'm just starting on my journey here.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. Yeah, Hofstadter. And it's fascinating because it's like, this is literally exactly what I'm thinking about with Gurdjieff and with other stuff, which is that like, I've been thinking in a very sort of like principle, what is the underlying thought or causal idea that has caused reality to manifest? And at this point, I believe that it's shapes, its numbers, its patterns, which then evolve into, matter and form and material, and then the various manifestations we have. So that's difficult to reconcile with a lot of things, free will, and also the weird effects of time. So that's where my gap is right now, because right now I'm also studying time. And my latest discovery is that apparently time only exists locally at the quantum level. Essentially, I'm reading this book by Ravelli called The Order of Time, and what he talks about is we kind of like know about relativity, right? Like if you're closer to the Earth, you're moving slower than somebody who's farther away from the Earth because of the nature of mass and how it affects the gravitational space-time field, essentially. Like more mass means slower time, essentially. But and we also know, like it's relatively common idea of like, if you go super fast, you can travel backwards through time, theoretically, right? Because it's the Superman thing. But even deeper, and this is not something I had any idea about, is he talks about the idea of what is it? He talks about the idea of at the quantum level, time is actually not continuous. Continuity of time is an illusion of low granularity at the scale at which we live. And in order to, like, if you look at the quantum level, you actually notice that there are like literal like particle level moments where time happens, and it only happens when it is a collapse of a quantum superposition state due to the fact that this time event, it's not explained like in super detail, just the principle is, so I don't really know the right words to use, but basically time occurs when these quantum elements of time in atomic individual discrete jumps make contact with physical matter. So it's almost like the space-time continuum or gravitational field, the space-time field itself needs to touch something or be observed or interact with something in order for time to happen. And until that point, it's not even clear whether or not the time that could occur next excuse me. Pardon me. It's not clear whether the time that could occur next is past, present, or future. there's an indeterminacy principle. And essentially what he's saying is that like you can imagine various locations of time as being individual subjective points where you can visualize them as cones, right? Where the future is forward and the past is behind, but they don't overlap because they're at individual points in space. So you can imagine all of these individual points of time as these hourglass structures that are all kind of like independent, because essentially there is no such thing as absolute time. There is only relative time, and even a single point is in relation to every single other one, and it's subjective, and you just don't know what it is until you observe it, essentially. So the quantum statement takes it even further and says that, I think I understand, if I understand this correctly, the time that you experience is the only time that is in a state of superposition collapse. So it is the only state that you personally can observe, and besides that, then time in other locales is completely unknown. And I don't know if that has something to do with the nature of like, I don't know if that is a more of a solipsistic argument where it's like, you know, because of your observation, or if it's like in pockets of space where something is happening, there is a local time over there, but none over here, but our own different local time over there. Or if he's saying, because of the fact that we cannot observe time anywhere else, as far as we know, literally anything could be happening in the realm of time elsewhere. And it's kind of fucked up.
It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with that. But yeah, that's what I've been reading lately, and I'm still only like 30% of the way through that book. It's a nice read, very easy and accessible. Just like they throw a lot at you very quickly in sequence, because it's like all the big ideas about time jammed into one book, I think. So
Yeah, you know, what you're talking about, especially the bits about like sort of spiraling in upwards into like greater complexity. That feels like that's actually where a lot of the I guess maybe even we could say real problems of like fate or free will arise. You know, where it feels like, you know, what people are looking for out of, you know, freedom from fate, perhaps, is some sort of like power, you know,
yeah.
or like some sort of yeah, capacity to like integrate and deal with some sort of challenge. And so I have this image of like, you know, not only is our experience of time connected to like how many sort of bits of information or like the ecosystem that is our self, kind of like its sort of spin, or its like complexity of movement, and the like harmonization of all of that.
Yeah.
Like that feels like that's a model for like the self and its evolution and its capacity to like integrate all the things that could otherwise limit it, or yeah, be experienced as some sort of like imposition of fate. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, going back to the Indian perspective on karma, there are still things that are like probably inherently, you know, just physically unconquerable, you know, you could
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Like, man, you know, like I had a genetics like coaching session a couple months ago, and it
How's
really
that
changed my.
interesting?
It was really fascinating. Like the main focus is on nutrigenomics,
I'm not
but it
familiar with that
really,
at all. Is it like
well, it was like,
nutritional genome stuff?
yeah,
Gotcha.
basically there's like immense variability in our relationship to any number of different substances. Like this idea of a one size fits all diet is like total bogus.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it had this like, you know, interesting effect on me relative to this all this thinking about, you know, astrology, or you know, magic, or like positive mind metaphysics, or what have you. Like that what we call fate is like very much bound up with the body and its like inherent, I don't know, organizing principles.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think different people have different wiggle room with that. Like some people have like, a shitty hand,
Mm-hmm.
and some people have like an awesome hand. And that has like exponentially compounding implications,
Yeah.
And so what we think about as fate or free will, I think the most tangible way to speak about it is really in relationship to things like our genetic code. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I've had some complicated feelings about the idea of genetics being related to karma or being related to um, race and ethnicity and nationality for a while. Particularly triggered by the fact that there's this neo-Nazi offshoot of Hinduism. Essentially, it's called like Kali accelerationism, and it's basically or Kaliak, and it's basically like this very bizarre, firmly Hindu-based idea of spiritual and racial supremacy that is
Hmm.
like cross life, reincarnative. And the idea is that
Yeah.
like if you're white in this life, you'll be reincarnated again as white in the next life because that's your lineage or whatever, which I think is
Hmm.
total BS. Like I don't think that makes any amount of sense from a spiritual perspective. Like why would that ever be the
Hmm.
case? Like that's so restrictive, and just not how anything I've seen seems to work. But it's interesting at the same time because there is evidence of certain types of you know stories, I should say, right? Like
Hmm.
clearly some people their astrology paints a huge picture of, and not necessarily in a supremacist or racist way, but just race and home and identity being a huge part of who they are and being a huge part of their karma. And whether or not that ends up being like the sort of deal where it's really about that specific, life experience in that life, or if it's like, yes, you actually have a bond to this race or a bond to this, ethnicity or whatever, and you're here to protect or defend or what have you, and maybe there's like a dark outcome from that path as well, and that's racism and that's war and that's conflict and that's genocide. And I don't know, like this is me literally just making shit up off the top of my head to like think about possible permutations of these ideas.
Yeah.
But like it is really interesting because we also definitely do know that on a local scale this stuff is very real, like the idea of what is it, epigenetic trauma and epigenetic like cycles of
Totally.
pain and therapy and like treatment and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know, it's there's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually within anthroposophy too. Like
Oh,
Steiner
okay.
said, even at like the end of one of my favorite of his books, he said like if you're doing evolution right, you'll like incarnate into more evolved races.
Interesting.
Totally racist.
Yeah,
Totally
wow.
racist. And
Yeah.
he was, like the head of the German Theosophical Society.
Mm-hmm.
And within Theosophy, there's this idea of like root races and of like, different races, even different races being associated with different like planetary archetypes.
Huh.
Like,
Wow.
and definitely elements of that were like incorporated into not Steiner necessarily. Like Steiner was like at other points he's like firmly anti-racist, firmly like in favor of like the sovereignty of the individual. Like
Mm-hmm.
Steiner is all about freedom, and the uniqueness of each individual. Like he also said each individual is a race unto themselves.
Hmm.
But within Theosophy, there was like a way in which some of the offshoots of that started to like weave into some of the Nazism. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like not, yeah, the Nazi, even though like Hitler was not overtly like esoteric in some way, a lot of his supporters were like, you know, theosophically bent or like definitely esoterically bent. I mean, even like there was you know, Hitler was probably in consultation with an astrologer through most of
Oh yeah, yeah, I absolutely believe
and
that.
and there's even suggestion that did you see that book Adolf and Alistair by Doug
Uh-uh.
Rushkoff?
No.
It's a comic book that basically suggested that Alistair Crowley was working with the Brits to feed bad astrological information to Hitler.
Huh. Wow.
And that also there is this sort of like magical battle having to do with like V for victory symbol.
Hmm.
Pretty crazy book. And I love Doug Rushkoff, super brilliant thinker. Um, but anyways, yeah, there are certain ways in which this whole conversation about evolution or genetics, yeah, very quick, or even individuality or individual freedom.
Hmm.
Like there are definitely clear ways in which it tinges on, uh, at the very least, like a white Eurocentric point of view. Like even the ideal of the individual or individualism is like a pretty Western European thing. Like in
Yeah.
most other cultures, they tend to be much more like community oriented.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's probably a reductionist statement too, but
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's very interesting because, like, I don't know. There's some relationship, like you say, between body and spirit in a way that is almost bespoke at times. Like it almost feels like you said, every person is a race unto themselves. Every person has their own specific like fit and story. And I
hmm.
think there's obviously like astrologically, karmically, racial stories that people live out. Otherwise, why would we be doing all of this stuff that's happening?
Yeah, certainly.
And but yeah, I don't know how to resolve it because like the woke left part of me wants to be like, nah, none of that shit matters. But that's also like a very Western way of thinking, which is like it doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. You should be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, and you should be able to have your goals and your outcomes. So like it's complex for me because I do see there being an interesting sort of like story there spiritually between there being a relationship to almost like a race current and certain ideologies, which are not necessarily like Nazi supremacy ideologies, but like literally just like modes of being through life that maybe due to like your cultural upbringing, like if you're a
Hmm.
spirit who wants to come into the world and like do a bunch of stuff and build lots of stuff and like basically conquer things or live in a way where you get to construct things that is very Western, it makes sense for you to be placed into a Western body, into a Western lifestyle, into a Western context where you can achieve your aims. So like, I don't know, it's very fraught, right? Because like that's not something I would ever suggest to somebody in a reading, or that I would ever really talk about outside of the context of like a conversation with you, who I feel like you have a nuanced understanding of this. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah, I don't know.
yeah,
It's difficult to talk about, and it's difficult to think about because it's difficult to talk about.
yeah, certainly. And especially today, I mean, it's difficult. Yeah, so sometimes it's hard to have these sort of I find it hard to have these conversations in certain contexts.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like I'm thinking about just to bring it back to like these questions of like free will or
Mm-hmm.
destiny or what have you. So I feel like the ideal of freedom is sort of in favor of the individual's creative power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
Very
the ideal
solar.
of destiny, what did he say? Solar?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, totally. Yeah, like true will, sort of. But I feel like the ideal of destiny actually has to do with the interweaving of the individual with the community,
Mm-hmm.
or with it's like the individual is like an electrical force, and the moment of destiny is like that force finding its socket or whatever. And so I feel like there's this inherently relational or contextual ideal of destiny, which is a lot. I don't know. I feel like in some way it also takes a pressure off the individual.
Mm-hmm.
It's like instead of the individual just being like alone, in having to create their own reality, there's like a calling. There's like a teleology. There's like a an end point.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like I found a lot of comfort from that as well, and it's it's interesting because like I guess my current stance is that life is basically determinism with benefits. That's how I kind of put it. Where like for the most part, you're on a track. Like Gurdjieff, as you said, has this idea of like people being almost entirely robotic, and they
Hmm.
develop free will. They literally develop a soul throughout the time of their lifetime.
Hmm.
I don't know if I agree with that per se, but he says some interesting stuff about the fact that like they develop bodies, like they literally create their second, third, and fourth like astral, causal, and another
Hmm.
etheric bodies over the time of life. And maybe that's true, or maybe it's just you learn to connect to it, like you're just not aware of it at the time, and that's what that practice is. Because like I don't know, it seems as above so below, right? Like there should never be, it doesn't make sense that we have the law of conservation in our reality on a physical level, and then you can go around and say, well, actually spirit can be destroyed and spirit can be created when it's something that is inherently numinous and infinite. So that's kind of how I deal with that idea. But at the same time, it's like, yes, clearly we have these many, many different influences. Like the other day, I was doing some asteroid research, and I found, for instance, that on the day that I dropped out of, not on the day, but like around the time, very close within a couple of weeks, that I dropped out of college to go travel travel the country, was when I had a Icarus transit opposing my Jupiter. At the same time, Jupiter was also squaring my natal Jupiter. So I was making a T square to transiting Jupiter with Icarus, and apparently Icarus's indication is like flight, escape, running away, stuff like that. Um,
In like in like a way that's doomed.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, totally.
I remember that story. I
Yeah.
remember, yeah, you telling me about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
traveling.
and it was totally doomed from the outset. There was no way that was ever going to work. But and it just made me think like, holy shit, like, do I even have any of my own thoughts, or is it just somebody, something that's around
Hmm.
there? And then there's this other idea of like, oh, all these planets or all these asteroids may have actually been part of another planet that was much more kind of like even Gaia focused than our own Earth, because that's where like Ceres
Yeah.
comes from, that's where Pallas, Vesta, all these other planets come from, and it's like, sure, we have free will, and Gurdjieff's big thing is that you don't have free, the only choice you can actually make is which influence you choose at a given time.
Hmm.
And he's like, there are all these massive influences happening constantly to you, and if you're not remembering yourself, or essentially kind of like being aware of the eye observer, I think is what he means by that, at all
Hmm.
times, then like you're just giving yourself away to one of these influences, and the only thing you can do is to become
Hmm.
aware of them and then choose one of them to
Yeah.
achieve your aims, essentially.
Hmm.
So it's a very interesting thing because like I sometimes find myself wondering if like the phenomenological quality of free will is noticeable, because there are certain times where I feel more like alert and present and focused and like, yes, this is what I want, like this is what my purpose wants in a way. But then you kind of
Hmm.
also come back to that, like, is that just teleological destiny, or like, are you
Hmm.
just kind of following up on what you were already primed to be here to do? But most of my understanding of this topic just comes from like the various samplings of multiple sources, and figuring that like pretty much every major religion I've heard of either has the idea of free will or has the idea that you can assert free will at certain moments or in certain times.
Hmm.
Because like for me personally, I've definitely felt that way, in that like for my own life, part of my lesson is to learn to develop an initiative
Hmm.
to do the things that I know will bring change to this world. But I've also had the specific impression that if I don't do it, somebody else will do it. If I don't do
Hmm.
it, somebody else is going to get this mission and going to get this idea, and they're going to build it. So like if I want it for myself, which is, a big part of my story, like being so super Leo, I have to do it. I have to choose to engage with it. And that's kind of all over my astro chart. Like it's all about leadership, it's all about doing things, it's all about making stuff happen. So
Hmm.
Drake, you're muted.
Right. I hear them.
Oh, you do?
I hear them.
Oh, I can't hear you. Let me. Oh, I'm sorry. The mute was individual. I see. That's why. Okay, go ahead.
I've found that I've had some very original ideas, but no means to get them out to the world. But a few years later, I'll see, and this is just for like character designs for
Mm-hmm.
shows and stuff. But a few years later, I'll see someone else come up with basically the same design. So I feel like, well, the least I can do is put it out to the Akash, and someone else with
Hmm.
with the right connections will pick it up.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Like that happens to me too. Like I've had that exact same thing happen, and I think that's a real dynamic. You know, where like ideas are alive and ideas spread and ideas are like shared between people.
Platforms.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And like, let's see, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very like Rupert Sheldrake, like there's a sort of collective consciousness that we're all
Hmm.
pulling in from. And even the Taoist model, think of like, um, our different bodies, like this sort of human being is this intersection between like a sort of fixed sort or like limited supply of physical resources and also like an ancestral inheritance, and then like has this sort of access to higher inspirations, and like our life path is sort of like the mixing of those streams.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting
One
because, oh, go ahead.
one thing I've noticed is that in dreams, whenever I see something that looks completely ambiguous, I'm trying to figure out what it is, it immediately becomes clearly visible as my first guess. So
Hmm.
I feel, and it just like makes me realize that reality is a multiplayer dream, and
Mm.
the only reason why we can't manifest our thoughts as easily in reality is because all of our thoughts are competing with each other.
Hmm.
Mm.
I like that. Yeah, I like that a lot.
It's interesting how I feel like the ideal of, or a lot of the individualism, that I find even within spiritual communities of like manifestation or what have you, I feel like is like starts to break down at this point, and I feel like I think most people would experience that as a relief, like
Hmm.
lack of pressure on themselves or thinking that it's their individual moral failings or whatever, that they don't have all these, you know, like their experience isn't all their fault or
Hmm.
their responsibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And it's so tricky when you get into like the topic of stuff like, traumas and difficulties that you in these sorts of models would be said that like this event happening to you was always going to happen, or this illness was always going to happen because on some level you were supposed to learn from this experience on this life, which I think is perhaps part of why this idea might never reach the full mainstream, because it's so discomforting to our idea of what is fair and what we choose for ourselves. Um,
mhm.
at least on the level of just like, this is my life and this is my only life and I have to deal with it. Um, a lot of this is like, a long time ago, I dropped this entire train of thought because I was like, oh, well, free will versus determinism, who cares? Because you can't tell anyway, right? Like, so what's the point of giving a crap? But then, like, I guess now I'm wondering, like, what do we get if we know how to achieve free will? And, like, how would we know the difference? Like, Gurdjieff would say, even somebody like myself who's very interested in these sorts of topics and who's done a fair amount of like self work and meditation, things like that, and other practices, still has no free will. That even to this point, everything I've done has just been kind of the mechanical reaction of what I'm doing right now. And so now I'm kind of like wondering, maybe I should just listen to Gurdjieff less and some other people more, or like, is there really a true like state of free will and purpose where you can say like, yes, I get to, I now know that I'm in charge of my own destiny. Like my mom studied under Chinese astrology masters who say that you can change your fate and you can change your astrology and you can change your chart, but it's extremely hard and it just takes a
Mhm.
lot of intentional effort to be different and to choose to be different. And I have a I had a psychic for a while that I was seeing every now and then, just to while I was doing some exploration into spirit stuff. And she also mentioned that, like, sure, you can renegotiate your soul contract if you want, blah blah blah, some other stuff. Like, she just dropped it off kind of like out of nowhere. I was like, okay, like that's an interesting thing to hear you speak her out so matter of factly, you know. So yeah, I don't know.
Have you heard of these Indian palm leaf readings?
Nadi astrology. Yeah, I just
Yeah,
discovered that. Yeah,
yeah. I'm fascinated. Like,
yeah,
I really want to check it out, because there's, I don't know. I think it seems to a lot of people that that's like concrete proof of like some sort of predetermination. Um, yeah, I mean, and it's also fascinating that that's something that people can, potentially, like, these super cities masters can like foresee, even hundreds or thousands of years ahead of time. And also, one of the things that I found fascinating is that they even speak about, like, once you're done with that palm leaf, it's not as if they throw it away. They like keep it because it'll match somebody else in the future. Like, some
interesting.
other person in some future like life will have the same exact set of circumstances.
Whoa, that I was not aware of.
And it's interesting also because, like, as a part of that, like, there's also ways in which you can, like, your own soul healing is like prescribed within the palm leaves. Like, there's like both this pretty, not only rigid but precise set of deterministic factors, that have been predicted hundreds of years in advance. But there's also like a an onus, on the individual to like actually also take responsibility for their own like soul healing. And so, like, the flip side of the readings aren't just like to blow your mind. They're like to like help you work out instructions to like help you heal.
Yeah.
And the like journeys to healing, like Vedic remedies, Vedic like remediation is intense. It's like you've got to do these specific things like every day or like every Wednesday for like 3 months, you
Wow.
know,
Yeah.
or and then you do another set of things. Like, it's like all these like pretty intense uh, processes that you have to do, that you like really have to like give considerable effort towards. Um, and then the crazy thing is, apparently, you can actually have multiple palm leaves that fit you at different points of
Huh.
your life. Like, you can do one and then 10 years later have another one that fits your circumstances perfectly too.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and that I did not know. Is that in Light on Life? Do they talk about that more in detail?
I listened to this podcast with Adam Summer,
Okay.
Host to Heavens. Yeah, and he talked to this guy that runs like he was like one of the people that brought it to the West. He was like this I don't know, sort of spiritual seeker who had had this like crazy life that
Yeah.
like got this palm leaf reading, and the palm leaf was like, yeah, you're gonna bring palm leaves to the West. And now it's what he does. Yeah, but it's a really interesting podcast, and it's very, like a really interesting data point, in this set of questions.
Yeah.
um
Adam Summer, you said that was
some Pulse to Heavens. Yeah.
Host of Heavens. Okay.
Yeah, pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the that is not. I did not know that the fact that a leaf can apply to somebody else or you at multiple points, which makes more sense because I was like, okay, they made these leaves that are supposed to track every single person who's ever born from this point
Mm-hmm.
on, like all of the future, right? And so I was like, how could they possibly do that? Given that each natal chart is supposed to be unique, But then I was like, okay, well, there's got to be, and this has been kind of like my big hunt for the last, I guess, year, I'd say, is trying to find the underlying like mathematical structure of astrology
Mm-hmm.
and the rhythms and the timings of all the planets or some key factors. And I am starting to think like maybe it is um, maybe that's, you know, one key to that. The fact that you can actually use another palm leaf for your own life at a later point in time, or that one can get reused, is that maybe the leaves are telling these compartmentalized stories in some way that apply in certain times, in certain places, according to some like fundamental, you know, like cyclical overlap or something that makes all of it work together. Because I've been like, the fact that you can do all these different techniques, that all these techniques have been made, and that you can even draw sometimes like kind of wacky associations for yourself just based on some idiosyncratic thing and have it be correct in a natal chart, which, you know, is a little bit of psychism and a little bit of like astrology. The fact that that can work, and wait, crap, I lost my train of thought. This is a complicated one. So basically, like, I feel like the fact that perfections can work, that progressions can work, that, you know, solar returns can work, that all these techniques can work, like even something more fixed like planetary years and Daria can work on some level. You know, I think they're not as specific as these other techniques, but the fact that like you can combine them and get a pretty good sense, even just like using a brute force like hammer approach at it, of like, all right, we're gonna throw the entire kitchen sink at you and see what sticks onto your placements. Like, I feel like that reflects not the power of the techniques, although they are powerful, obviously, so much as the fact that there is a underlying rhythm and structure to the nature of astrology that enables all of these techniques to work in a cyclical way. Like turning the wheel, you know, doing perfections, anything where you're like, and crossing over boundaries, you know, like you've got this element of this Gurdjieffian Enneagram's upward spiral happening all over again. And it's like these rhythms are encoded everywhere. And I actually just got this little book, a little book of coincidences. You know this one?
Yeah, that's a super cool book.
Yeah. And like this is basically a book full of all the stuff I've been like just trying to research myself and have not been able to. I need to fully go through this, but like I do feel like this is where it's at. And I've been talking to Cantide a little bit, and he's very much on like the quantum, electromagnetic space, patterns, shapes, stuff like that. But he's more interested in like the actual like galactic reality of like what's happening in space and the sky and physics overall. So he's a little bit more level of concrete than I am, but he also includes a lot of astrology stuff in it. And he's had these very interesting ideas of like, I don't really know how to summarize them. I'd need to send you some of his links, but essentially they're all about the shape of space and an esoteric sort of model of how time and energy flows within the solar system, but it's all related to the idea of pattern, of shape, of circle, you said? Fractal, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so he's got some fractal stuff, some like pure shape stuff, some like all kinds of stuff, and I feel like it's all related. And I do feel like, you know, there may be some sort of big intellectual work that comes out of this area of Twitter or, you know, astro people, whatever, that can manage to tie all these ideas together, because I feel like we're all kind of simultaneously trying to solve the same problem in one way or another.
See, I'm trying to lead a cult that worships fractals.
Oh yeah.
but being the edgelord I am, there's some stuff in there about killing the rich and depopulating, and that's just kind of like the only person who's joined is some incel kid. So now that's the part that's getting enunciated and stuff. No. But the core of it was originally supposed to be about noticing all of the fractals in nature, but also being like the mammals that rose up after the fall of the dinosaurs, and just like it's time for just a new order, because the ones in charge have gotten too powerful, and I just want something. I just want to be able to stand a chance in life when I have the skill set of a Pisces, and all I can really do is try to lead a cult or something.
Well, I think that's a popular theme nowadays.
I hate everything that I've seen of the workplace. And I know I'll only be able to be myself if I can live on my own, but I can't pay rent. No, I'm just looking for some way to be able to.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big movement nowadays. Like let's start a commune, let's start cults, let's do our own thing, because I think the larger overall system has failed us in many ways.
Except I don't believe in communism because I was that one kid who nobody shared with. So
Yeah.
I'm an abolitionist.
Yeah. Well, a commune doesn't have to be communistic necessarily. Just a place for
I
people
don't
to
believe
go,
in socialism.
or whatever. I don't know what, like, a commune to me is just a bunch of people in one place, like trying to make a home, whatever structure you put on top of it.
If if
Interesting to, it's interesting to think about this element of fractals though in relationship to these deterministic patterns,
you
because
see,
fractals.
my goal is to like alter the fractal with free will to like aim close to the center of the fractal to like make a bigger alteration in it because I want my life to feel like it had a purpose. I'm like I just want to make a difference.
Yeah, because the fractal is this, interesting interplay between some sort of fixed repeating order
That's
and
God, that's the universe. But I'm on a quest to slay God.
damn.
Yeah, maybe you should check out some left-hand path stuff. I don't know.
I've been there.
I see. Yeah.
In my late teens, early 20s, I was all kinds of. I was just an edgy, obsessively theistic Satanist. I don't know. I'm just autistic
I
as
see.
fuck.
So you've been through it. Yeah. Well,
I've been there, done that,
yeah.
and I don't particularly like being reminded of it. But when the topic comes up, I always say, "Yeah, it happened."
Yeah. Well, at least now you know. Charlie, what were you saying about the fractals on fixed versus?
Well, yeah, it's interesting how it's a model for like, we could call it free will, but we could also call it like spontaneity or creativity. This like endless dance between a repeating pattern or like some guiding form and like always there's always also new complexity emerging or new directions emerging. You really ought to read I mean, I haven't finished it myself, but Carrie Welch's book, The Fractal Nature of Time, The Topology of Time. She did you ever hang out with Carrie? Carrie's one of my good friends.
I think I met Carrie once. She came to a astrology Austin Astrology Association meeting, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
She
I got to
presents
meet her
speaking.
once, but that's it.
Yeah, she's a badass. And her work is also even looking at like brainwave state models and like models of evolution of consciousness in relation to these like yeah, like delineations of how time, like the different experiences of time.
Mm-hmm.
And she also teaches sacred geometry at California Institute of Integral Studies.
Oh, cool.
And so and teaches like math and physics for artists. And
Nice.
so she's like very much at this like intersection between these two. And she's also an astrologer, very much at the intersection between these two. But yeah, and I feel like that's probably the most nuanced like mathematical model, that we have to understand the cosmos. Like even if you go back to like some of the early like philosophers of the Western mystery tradition were also geometers or, like philosophy, natural science, like, and the mysteries were all one, web.
Yeah.
And, the metaphors that we use to understand like God or perfection or what have you were like the circle,
Yeah.
or like the triangle. And now we're working with like these much more nuanced, models. And I guess we'll even like, the fractals, like we only encountered fractals once we had the computing power to like model out these like intense algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
And look how much they've like caught on to the consciousness. Like everybody's so aware of fractals as like this
Universe.
Yeah. I really do feel like I've been coming along to this idea that knowledge is alive and that understanding is alive in its own way, and that, like, people are always talking about, oh, we're about to enter a new, stage of vibration, or we're about to ascend or stuff. Like, that's very starseed stuff. But, like, I think it is, like, actually happening in a way, just in a less dramatic, fluffy sort of sense. It's happening on the intellectual sphere of the entire world, of how, young people, people kind of like that are in the middle of doing this intellectual work are able to latch onto and move alongside. Like, I've had so many conversations with people about the exact same thing that I've been studying, just through a different lens, with like no planning, no preparation, no anything like that. And that's been happening basically ever since I got on Twitter and was able to notice it. That once I was like amongst people who were my intellectual peers, like, I've got Facebook friends and stuff, but they're not interested in the same stuff I am. Like, they're just focused on other things. But like when I imagine it's the same for them, where they're in their own works or whatever they're doing, like, knowledge is continuing and knowledge is transpiring, and the things that they're thinking about, they're probably also seeing among people who share their sort of path and interests and focus. So like, I do think it is alive in some sense, and like, I still haven't, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff between the math and the abstraction in my brain and like where we live now, and then there's everything in between of like the spirit world, and then the world of like medium level granularity, I guess, which is like, what's the next level, what's the conclusion there. And that's what I want to find out, because like, I know I keep coming back to this, but I do think it's inscribed in astrology and in the nature of the planets themselves. And I'm like, even maybe there's some sort of numerical quality if we found some way to analyze, like, say, a planet like Saturn. If we analyze the timing relative to Saturn, because we could actually, like, it's never done, but you can do Mars-based astrology, you can do Saturn-based astrology, but even just looking at the mathematics behind how Saturn perceives the world and the solar system, maybe there's something interesting in there at a mathematical level. I don't know. I'm just riffing.
Interesting to know.
My friend Gemini Brett thinks that each planet has its own zodiac, and that it's actually pretty much the same as our zodiac, because he has this model of the zodiac as sort of like this sacred geometrical structure that emanates from the center of the Earth. Like, the zodiac isn't the constellations. It's actually like a idealized 360-degree, dissection of the ecliptic of the sun. And so, like, that evolves out of, the geometry of the Earth's relationship to the sun and its orbit through the year. And so we can map that out, like, into the geography of the Earth according to, like, the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. And so he thinks that every other planet has something akin to that, but it would be wildly different, like, because the different planets have different orbits relative to the sun. Like Mercury, for example, doesn't have the wobble that the Earth does. The Earth has like the 23.5 degree axis relative to the sun. Mercury is like dead on.
Yeah.
Like, it has no wobble.
Yeah.
And it's actually, its day is like twice as long as its year.
Wow.
And so it's like always, you could actually walk on the surface of Mercury, and like, if you walk towards, like, if you're at the sunset point, you could like continually walk towards the sun, and always you could be in an eternal twilight. It's not crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy. That's really crazy.
No, but you're totally right.
Oh,
go ahead.
I was just saying, like, it makes me think of the fact that, the moon, due to how it rotates and spins around us, we're only ever seeing one side of the moon. And like, that seems fake, like, that doesn't seem like it should be what happens, but it does.
Yeah.
Like, just so many perfect things. But what were you going to say?
Creepy. It's creepy.
It's creepy.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I've really been.
Just last night I was watching George Norrie's show on Gaia, and he talked about what Ingo Swann saw on the dark side of the moon. I was thinking it doesn't disprove Corey Good.
Yeah.
I don't know. We did. Well, I was just going to say that I've been very interested in, like, these cosmic dimensions of spirituality, like literally with space, trying to find like star wisdom, that's beyond just astrology. And I think astrology is like, this brilliant tradition that was probably like clairvoyantly discerned, 2,500 years ago. But like I think the relationship between consciousness, like human consciousness and cosmos, is like much more, like there's a lot more going on than just astrology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is like a big project of mine right now, and also like a reason that I'm, here at the Goetheanum trying to study Steiner, and also I don't know if I've told you about this, but this project that I've been doing with Olivia Pepper, where we've been writing this book about Mercury,
Oh
and
yes,
we're
I think
calling it star poetry.
yeah. I still need to. I'm sorry I never got to your paper, but I read like the first half of it and was really into it and just got distracted by something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no worries. Yeah, and so we're calling this star poetry, and we're hoping to write a book on all the planets.
Nice.
And like our approach is to like conceive of the planets as sort of spiritual beings and examine their role in astrology, but also like think about them, from myriad different angles.
You should,
Like
you should follow Gigi Young on YouTube. She's been
Gigi
making
Young.
Gigi Young. She's a psychic. She's been making a series of videos lately about like the relationship with Venus and Mars and Mercury and Earth. And I mean, there is like some stuff about like the theosophical switch between Mercury and Venus. But there's a lot of stuff in there about like the relationships of the planets and what they symbolize and why they symbolize what they symbolize. There's several like approximately 3-hour videos that she's made lately if you ever just want to let them run in the background while you're doing something.
Yeah, this looks fantastic. She looks, you know, right along my alley. But yeah, and so this is even like, recently become a lot more interested in like UFOs and contact with non-human intelligences, and like a super 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 big rabbit hole that I feel like, a lot of people dedicate decades of their life to it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
a couple books in. but
Yeah.
it feels to me that this is I mean, it's just so clear that this is like when we're talking about spirit, or the heavens, or angels, or um, you know, like upward movement and evolution, or like all these sort of like spatial metaphors are literally related to the heavens, literally related to space. And astrology is one segment of that, but there's also like so many other manifestations of it. And even, I mean, pretty much the argument that I've found that I really like is that uh, humanity's pretty much always been in contact with spiritual beings from space.
Yeah.
We've just
And
always
they're us from the future.
and they might be us from
Yeah.
the future. They might be us from the future, or we might just be relating to them in different manners. But like the ways that we can, break this down according to different like star tribes that people have different recurring experiences with, like it's very like it's very delineated,
Yeah. I
even
mean,
though it's a mystery.
the more I look into this stuff, the more I'm like, okay, everything is at least a little real. Like, I have it on fairly good authority from somebody I trust that, like, reptilians may actually be a thing, like,
Hmm.
for real, just like among us everywhere.
Hmm.
I mean, not everywhere necessarily, but like, this is just something I've only barely begun to touch the surface of, Like,
Yeah.
basically, this friend of mine told me that another friend of his is an extremely good psychic who was able to essentially like do a full body scan of him in cue with him just thinking and directing his attention to parts of his body over the internet. And like, he was like legit, like he knew exactly where his attention was at every moment. He would move it unprompted, and this other guy would be like, oh, now, yeah, so about your leg, about your stomach, about your whatever. So like, this guy was very clearly like just has cities out the wazoo, like way more than most people. And even Daniel Ingram, right? Like,
Yep, the
yeah,
Buddhist dude. Yeah.
yeah, that guy. So apparently Daniel Ingram even met this dude and was like, yeah, he's legit. He's one of the most like powerful people I've ever met. And so this guy swears that that well, no, swears. He just says that he knows that reptilians exist because their
Yeah.
energy bodies are different from human energy
Mm-hmm.
bodies, and it's
Yeah.
easily discernible if you have that sense. Which made me be like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, if you think about it, the idea of how like the primordial soup example is kind of dumb. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, people are like, oh well, it's like the Big Bang Theory. It's just like, and one day there was an explosion. But with primordial
Mm-hmm.
soup, it's like, and one day there was soup, and then stuff came out of it, because like there's this whole idea that humans were seeded or developed or came from somewhere else or whatever. And the more you start to think about a lot of these deep rabbit holes and the information that they imply, it's kind of like, well, why the hell not? Like, it fits pretty well
Mm-hmm.
with everything else. Um, and
Recently heard Gigi Young say that the reptilians are like either a future offshoot or just a breakaway civilization of humans that combine their DNA with reptiles to like survive, I think, beneath the surface of Mars or something.
whoa,
Yeah.
that's hardcore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, definitely like a couple of my favorite thinkers in this space who are people that I've like, had contact experiences that like each of these people are actually like have a really strong resonance with the mantis beings.
Hmm.
Yeah. And apparently mantis is connected with the word mancy, like, cartomancy or what have you.
Oh, interesting.
And like, these are like these mantis beings that are like 8 foot tall that wear these like super fancy robes.
Huh.
But uh, yeah, one of the ways that they're very interested in this like idea that these could be related to our future selves. Yeah, but there's also like there's this book called Meet the Hybrids that I've just started reading that these are testaments from lots of people that really understand themselves to be part alien, and that basically comes down to them understanding that they have like some sort of energetic body that comes from like a very specific star system or a very specific like archetypal energy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, even like one of these guys, you might have met, or I might have told you about my former roommate Michael Garfield, who
Yeah,
runs the
I
Future
grabbed coffee with
Fossils.
him once. Yeah, yeah.
Cool, yeah, yeah. His graduate advisor, who was this integral dude, one of the Sean Esplin Hargens. He was like, this integral ecology dude, like diehard Tibetan Buddhist. Like, he eventually had a kid and then had to stop like going to these meditation retreats and decided to like start following up on his interest in like fairies.
Hmm.
And eventually that like as he said, as he went deeper into the earth, he got like spit out into outer space and started having these experiences with star beings. And he's applied like the integral methodology of like trying to make sense of all knowledge, like seeing everything as being true but partial, and like basically just scanned the entire like literature, not saying like any specific person is right, but saying it's all like experience. And yeah, his paper Wild Cosmos is really fantastic in
What's
like
his name?
giving a Sean Esbjorn Hargens. I'll send you his
Okay.
I can actually just send you the paper.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
It's remarkable, and he even said something akin to like we all like our every morphogenetic form on Earth has some like stellar complement. Like each of the types of like star beings that we're encountering have some relationship with like some animal form on Earth. Like there are insectoids, there are reptilians, there are avian sort of creatures, like, and even he thinks that there's like the story that's being told here is that we on Earth aren't just like this, like, even though sort of evolution was a part of it and we can map it, there's also like some sort of distinct stellar influence where these are actual like archetypal beings that are all across the galaxy, all across the universe, that then like came into Earth at different points of our evolution. And like what we have on Earth is actually in some way like a microcosm of the entire macrocosm of the universe and all
That's
the life
thinking
that's
in
in the universe.
fractals.
Yeah.
Isn't it
yeah.
crazy?
And the craziest thing too to me is that like with kind of this overall idea is that it's very likely that we're not special either. Going on this fractal idea, there's probably many planets like ours out in the world, out in the universe, that are living through the same stories at the same level of intelligence, awareness, evolution, what have you.
Including
And
the ones that
probably
created
like
us.
and probably way higher too.
Yeah.
And I think it a lot like this question about time is actually one of the ways that we can break down these conceptual barriers that have us limited to this experience of ourselves as like the only intelligent life in the universe. Like if we think of time as something like way, 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 way bigger, than what we currently have.
And it repeats itself. It's not just a line; it's a fractal because civilizations rise and fall, and we could have been this advanced in the past longer ago than we have evidence of. It's just repeating.
Yeah, and we might have even been on other planets in our solar system at
Yeah,
other
I think
points
the ruins on Mars that I hope Elon or whoever finds when they land there, those could have been from us.
Yeah, well, that's the entire story of the Law of Ra, is that Venus and Mars were inhabited planets that used to be, or I don't know about Venus. They definitely touch on Mars.
I think I've had past lives beneath the surface of both.
Dang, that's intense. Yeah.
know.
Yeah, so I mean, Law of Ra talks about the idea that Mars used to be very human-like beings until they nuked the shit out of it. Literally, like they destroyed Mars in war, which is very fitting for Mars, right?
It's the archetype.
Yeah, exactly. And now, essentially, like we're the descendants of, I think, Mars people, at least partially, or something like that, in the Law of Ra, the Law of One. And Ra is. Have I talked to you about Law of One, Charlie? I feel. Okay, so
no, I'm looking it up right now.
It's very fascinating.
I've heard a lot about it on Gaia.
You should check it out. It's really cool. It's a project that was done, I believe, in the 60s and 70s. It was a channeled work where they interacted with this entity called Ra, who was actually like a collective interstellar intelligence or something like that. And he basically tells the story, or it tells the story, or they tell the story of Earth as being essentially just another evolutionary proving ground where eventually over time people will be harvested to move on to the next level or what have you, and it's fascinating because it basically ties together in this very like integralist approach, but like in terms of wacky interstellar beings talking about like the ancient pyramids. And they're like, yes, we helped the Egyptians build the pyramids specifically because the pyramids are actually designed as these prisms or healing structures where the very center where people are supposed to be entombed, those were actually a healing center designed by the structure of the pyramid. Because there's this entire idea of like magic pyramids where apparently you can just buy, like, you can try this experiment on your own, I guess. I need to try it still. But you can put any object underneath just a transparent or a hollow pyramid shape, like just a metal frame of a pyramid, and another fruit, for example, next to it, just like two apples. And then if you just leave them out, the apple that's underneath the pyramid will stay fresh for much, much, much longer than the one that is not inside the pyramid. And that's supposed to be some sort of inherent nature to the shape of the pyramid that causes it to have this effect. So like, I don't know, this Law of One is crazy because it basically goes into literally every single conspiracy theory you can possibly think of and like drops a little tantalizing tidbit about it here and there. And there are some things it like won't even talk about because it's like, you're not ready to know about that, or like, I can't talk about that right now, or something like that. But it's crazy because like they
knew I'd find it.
Yeah. But also through the story of this, they actually talk about somebody like a negative spirit or entity that is essentially trying to disrupt their sessions, and they receive all of this knowledge about like how to set up the table for tooling and tuning for perfect like transmission from Ra, and it's very detail oriented about this and seems like very specific and meaningful, which is fascinating because this is like the 60s and the 70s, you know, like you don't really have any context for why the hell they would care about any of this stuff. But looking back, it's kind of like, it seems almost like, it's almost like thinking about the ways in which angels told John Dee the contraptions that he needed to communicate with angels more effectively, right? And the law, in the Law of One, Ra is doing the exact same stuff. Now, it's all completely unverifiable, obviously, but super, super interesting. And there's a ton of like fascinating stuff where every single thing that came in, I was like, this doesn't really contradict any specific thing that like any specific belief system. Like it pegs in perfectly to all of these other ideas around the topics that it presents.
Different belief systems to each other, because I believe that all religions can coexist and they're just all a part of a greater whole. And there are photographs of pyramids on Mars.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I gotta look those up. Okay, that's cool.
Pyramids on Mars?
Pyramids on Mars. Yeah, they talk about all the time on Ancient Aliens and stuff.
Yeah, I will check that out for sure, because that sounds relevant to my
And they're
interests.
in the exact same layout as the pyramids in Egypt.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. A part of this whole, you know, like galactic memory sort of thing is this way in which it's clear that our collective imagination is a part of this like whole unfolding evolutionary story, like the role that science fiction is playing in our like evolution of consciousness.
It's all channeled from the actual history of the universe.
Exactly. Like, so I even heard Sean Esbjorn Harden suggest that like the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that was like Lemuria or whatever.
It's like the Syrian elves. Like it's literally the cosmic history of the Syrian elves, and like Sauron is the real.
It was like actually Earth in the past.
Or it could be, or like all that's a metaphor, like, or you know, Steiner talked about like the different incarnations of the Earth. Like we're in the, you know, the fourth or fifth incarnation of the Earth, and that the
fragile civilization has risen and fallen in a pattern. We were so much more advanced in the past than science believed.
Yeah, we're in the fucking Kali Yuga right now.
Yeah.
We're like maybe on the upswing out of it.
Yeah. We're in the lame part of the universal cosmic cycle, man.
Yeah.
So
I've heard like
go ahead.
different things about Lemuria from Rudolf Steiner. Anyone familiar with Cryon? Oh, well, the entity is Cryon. The guy who channels him is Lee Carroll. If you go to YouTube on Cryon, you can find all these seminars. He talks a lot about Lemuria. It lines up with the same things Steiner said. And not just that, but someone recently tried to get me into that whole CCRU thing.
CCRU.
And I didn't. Oh God, no! It's real computer geek stuff that I don't really comprehend. But part of it talks about Lemuria. It's the only part that even registered in my brain, just because it's like the only thing that even somewhat resembles like the kind of like lore and mythology and stuff that I comprehend. But it went a bit like it's a bit different saying that it was actual lemurs. But hey, all Cryon ever said is that we were smaller. All Steiner ever said is that we were lighter and more flexible. So who's to say?
Yeah, I mean, you know, according to this idea of that these are archetypal races, maybe Lemurians were literally people that were like modeled after lemurs, or vice versa. I don't know.
I don't know about the CCRU thing, but I was
Yeah,
I
Cybernetic
was,
Culture Research Unit. That's cool.
yeah,
Experimental
I
Cultural Theorist Collective based out of Warwick University, England from 1995 to 97. I see.
I'm really good at. Someone showed it to me recently, but just when I was like going through like that and trying to like look at all these different narratives about Lemuria and compare them, and there were no discrepancies. Like I listened to like these things that Steiner, I think, said about them, and I really just got into trying to channel a past life, and it's one thing that I noticed is that I like memory and precognition is were like reversed in Lemuria, so nobody really recognized their surroundings, but at the same time, like the things that they thought of, they kind of just ended up seeing around them, and
Hmm.
I kind of like related to that a lot because I can be very forgetful as well, and I get a lot of shame for it in this modern society. But a lot of times I will just randomly have stuck in my head like the theme song of some show that I hadn't even thought of in like 15 years, and then I'll immediately hear someone talking about it
Hmm.
or see it, and it really happens a lot.
Yeah, so like a more like precognitive oriented race
Yeah,
almost that like
yeah.
that's very interesting. Yeah,
Mhm.
I
And like whenever they did randomly run into something in their surroundings, it would always like symbolize something prophetic
interesting.
to them, and the few that had a sense of memory, those were like the shamanic leaders.
Huh.
Like,
That's kind of funny. Like a total inverse of ours where like nobody can remember anything. The people who can remember stuff are freaking wizards and shamans. That's awesome.
yeah, just
I
I don't
want
know.
to I want to
I
come
don't. I find it hard to trust my intuition because I've been exposed to so much fantasy media, but I'd like to try to feel like I can try to remember some past lives. And at the end of the day, everyone's lived millions of lives, so really anything's possible. We've all been everything everywhere.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I've always wanted to get a past life regression thing done.
I tried to get one done, but I didn't trust it enough, and I was just crying because I didn't feel like it was working because I didn't see anything other than just the usual static behind my eyes, and the things that I did see, I thought that I was just imagining, and I just felt like they were influenced by just fantasy video
Mhm.
games that I grew up with. I'm having more faith in them now as I think more about it, because this was the other example I wanted to give about like a past life that where we just thought completely differently, and that was where like basically I don't know if I don't know if Corey Good's telling the truth or not, but around this time, I definitely wanted to believe that I had an Anshar life because I just related to his description of that race. So I really tried hard to like imagine or just remember. Remember sounds more credible, less shameful than imagine. Just remember this life is in this race of either inner Earth or inner Venus, kind of elven beings, and basically they were so they were psychic, or just like they were empathic. When you get that empathic, society just becomes a hive mind because everyone feels what everyone else feels, and there was just this image just these elven beings in white robes holding hands, like circling around a big, like a crystal orb, and like that was the vision that I imagined in some cave beneath the surface of either the Earth or Venus, and I basically came up with the idea from that that was my past life, but now in this life I've chosen to reincarnate as a human on Earth to experience individuality because I was curious about
Hmm.
how individuality felt.
That's cool. I like that because like it creates space for you know, there's this idea overall that humans are special in that we do have this individuality and that we do have this free will, and that's, you know, through so much of our esoteric literature, our mainstream religious literature, and just the way that we act, you know. And it's hard to know whether that's intrinsic or not, but it definitely seems like, you know, there are these entire realms of spirits who, especially like, you know, say something like elementals, supposedly are very powerful, like much more powerful than us on a spiritual level, but they have no free will. Like their entire role is to protect their realm or to serve as like helper spirits or some kind like that.
That's,
So, you know, maybe
that's
it's
why that's why like elementals are when summoned are typically more helpful than say demons
yeah.
will be.
Yeah, exactly. But like even demons, you have the power to bind according to Western esotericism because we carry, you know, the spark of divinity or the spark of God or what have you, and it's just very strange to think that
It's the higher dimensional beings that are easier for us to control because they're more empathic to us.
yes, yeah, definitely. Like the demons, you know, they don't want to be controlled. They don't want to help us. Like we have to force them. Not that like I don't really have personal experience with that. That's just my understanding of the theory. But Charlie, I wanted to go back to one of the things that you had mentioned about how astrology is clairvoyantly likely was clairvoyantly discerned at some point, which I agree with. Like, I feel like that's where many of our practices come from. Like, they were these ancient sages who derived it. And I do kind of feel like very similar to what you're saying is that we even need to reach beyond astrology, because I feel like, at least in terms of the discourses that I've been having or seeing, or the way that people think about the nature of reality and astrology, is that like people kind of seem happy with what astrology has to give them, which is great, you know, on like on a practical level. But like, I think that you and I want more from all of reality inherently. And I think that on some level, like, I do sense that there's going to be a point where I kind of need to leave astrology behind. Like, I'll probably be working with planets and, you know, like reality and physics and stuff like that, and using a lot of astrological principles. But I do think that the astrology of the future that's able to tie in these other ideas and become more exact and specific either already exists, possibly in Jyotish. Like, it's very likely that I just need to know more Jyotish. Like, maybe they already have it all figured out. Or there's a synthesis of these new ideas that are being unveiled to us that we need to incorporate into something. Because I don't know, man. Like, I think it's all in the numbers. I think it's all there somehow if we can like find the right way to look at it or the right way to reason about it. I just haven't found the structure. Because I mean, there's this amazing. I think I sent you a couple things. Did I send you that David Cochran video where he does talk about the zodiac as this Fibonacci sequence derived structure?
No, but I'm familiar with that from Russ Olhausen.
Yeah, so
definitely in that same case.
Yeah, I think Russell, I may have found it through Russell, I don't know, or I forget where I saw it, but basically, like, it's crazy. It can subdivide, like, when you look at the mathematical properties of the zodiac, you can subdivide the modes, the elements, the individual signs, like, you can make up the rhythm of the signs, like every single sort of structural component of the zodiac is perfectly described by a Fibonacci sequence, essentially. And it's like a specific form of the Fibonacci sequence, but it still is. It's still very fractal, which even perhaps suggests that you could subdivide it even further, maybe. Who knows? Like maybe you can get fractally deep into the wheel itself and go deeper and deeper and get finer and finer grained sets of information. I don't know. But like there's that, and then there's also this idea of, God, who was it? I forget. There's somebody else who's also into this idea of like astrological number theory, I guess. It's not coming to mind though, but like just the David Cochran stuff alone is fascinating to me because it implies that the same sorts of like it implies that astrology isn't special. It is hooked into this underlying Fibonacci number nature of reality. It is just the final expression of that thing. So I don't know. I'm just trying to keep myself open to looking at this, but it's also difficult to think like, okay, well, how do you create a whole new form of study based on something you don't even know what you're studying yet, you know? So
well, I guess my like simple response to that is that I feel like astrology or trying to make a sense of all the astrologies, like, is literally just too complex to be workable. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like you
But I mean,
can't do.
and the Chinese zodiac is essentially just Jupiter, because like each of their signs reflects one of our Western signs, and like the traits of it align with whatever sign Jupiter would be in that year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and integrating other forms of astrology too, like Chinese astrology. Like when you get down into it, like my mother is a Chinese astrologer, and it's totally different from Western astrology. Like there's certain elements, but the rules are extremely different. But you come up with very similar delineations regardless. But it's interesting because, like, I've got this book here. Like according to Chinese astrology, there are specific days where nobody should do anything. Where there are specific days that are bad for your sign based on the year. But you can also get much deeper and like know day by day, like with something like Bazi, which is I think the four square. I think that's what it means. The four square form of like fortune readings, essentially. It's like a form of Chinese astrology that's really good for forecasting luck and doing sort of electional oriented things. And I think you can also use it as a form of horary astrology, which is also very cool. But there are like it's completely different. It's entirely based on numbers and like when you were born, and that's got a map to something astrologically or planetarily, because you never talk about a planet, you never even talk about stars with Bazi, I don't think. But then there's something like Ziwei Doshu where you do talk about stars, but you're talking about fixed stars. You're talking about a metaphor of a giant tree with all of these branches, and there's 168 different stars or limbs or something like that. I forget. But like, you still inscribe it around 12 boxes, though. That's the fascinating thing. And then the limbs move around. So it's like there's clearly some commonality between all of these systems, and I bet that we can find it. Maybe it is too complex to find, but like I think that the fundamental rules, if we get enough angles on it, maybe we can find something a little more baseline. I don't know. We probably need a physicist.
Yeah. Well, I guess a couple responses to that. One, it's like I do know that one of the common denominators of so many of these forms of astrology is aspects between the planets. Like that's something that is like full moon, new moon, the lunar cycle, relationships between the planets. That's something that, like, regardless of which way you cut it, that's going to be like you can hang your hat on that. That's Will Morris too is like, I'd say actually of all the friends that I have, you and Will are like the people that I feel like have studied the widest variety of astrological systems.
Oh,
And Will is also using them like in clinical practice.
oh,
you
interesting.
know and so he's been doing it for decades too, and that's his. He uses I mean, when you do like a medical astrology reading with you, he's looking at Western astrology and Vedic astrology, and but he's very tuned into the nodes of the moon and to the aspects between the planets and the midpoints between the planets. And
Oh,
so,
interesting.
like, yeah, and so I think his approach to all this complexity of astrology is especially looking for the common denominators.
So it's interesting
Uh,
that you say that. Or sorry, did you have more?
no, and then the other thing that I'd say is, like, I feel like like there's astrology. Astrology is like, I feel, as much an art as a science. And so, I feel like you're um, like playing with astrology, or like doing the artistic action of astrology, especially through market research. And I feel like at there's the effort to like do concrete testing and experimenting, and yeah, then there's like, I don't know, astrology also as a more like religious or spiritual way of life, astrological magic or astrological remediation or what have you. And so I guess my feeling is that the astrology of the future is going to take like probably that pathway more towards like focusing on remediation, uh, or using it as like a like a rhythmic blueprint for how to, like it's like a it's like a it's a calendar, like something that we can work with. It's like cosmic rhythms, but I don't know if I actually see a lot of like I'm sort of given up on the project of like trying to use all the techniques.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, like I'm aware of multiple different Time Lord systems and like transits and multiple different progression systems, and then there's solar arc progressions, and then there's the like on some level like it is too complex to be workable for an individual, and so I feel like you actually like the only response to that is like you know you have to pick and choose what you're going to work with and take it as like a calendar that isn't necessarily going to be like you have to work with what's workable. Like you have to work with what you can actually handle, rather than uh, I don't know. And who knows? Like I guess there's also like when you get AI into it or what have you, like or when there's like more detailed forms of quantitative analysis, like perhaps we can decode some of these structures like from a more mathematical basis. But I mean, my response to the like overwhelming number of techniques and approaches to astrology, which are often contradictory, is to just to go more towards the artistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
You go to the artistic approach, and then you like use it as a tool for diagnosis. It's like it almost becomes something closer to the enneagram than like yeah, I guess that's my response to it. And that's why I'm interested in this idea of like star poetry, as like
Mm-hmm.
living ritual, like you
Yeah.
know more as the like trajectory that I'm trying to head towards, like really integrating astrology with like ritual practices or like spiritual matters rather than like just trying to be a cosmic quant.
That's a good way to put it. Cosmic quant. That's fucking funny. I like that. I might steal that.
You should. You're a cosmic quant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because like I do agree. So the thing is that I don't think that depth is necessarily the answer. Like I don't think it makes sense to go so deep into every single technique and then like learn all the ins and outs and try and like synthesize it, because like every technique in of itself is already an art to my mind, and the mathematical quantizable pieces should be the commonalities between them. Like for example, what I'm thinking of is the way you described the rhythmic blueprint is actually great, because that's almost exactly what I'm trying to construct for. I'm going to submit an article to a. Do you know Alex Criddle on Twitter by any chance?
Mm.
So he's got a kind of like a multidisciplinary journal that he's starting for various perspectives in magic, and he asked me to submit something,
Sweet.
and
That's awesome.
I'm planning to submit a article, if I can pull it together, essentially on the structure of life that's implied by all of these different techniques. So I'm planning to look at solar returns, at perfections, at maybe progressions, things like that. And essentially, I want to visualize a map of the different periods of life according to some of these larger granularity, like lower granularity techniques, like yearly perfections and solar returns, and some other techniques, because you could literally like visualize it as you could visualize the entire band of time going forward from left to right, with left being the very start being your birth, and then multiple rows with color coding to show the influences of different planets and different phases of life according to perfection. And I feel like if you zoom out far enough into that and look at the color and look at the keywords that are associated with it, you can build some sort of common picture of what a life is going to look like over that period of time. So that's the kind of thing that I want to use, like literally using quant stuff to build art, to build
Hmm.
more intuitions about how it works structurally, because I do believe that the universe, or at least our solar system, operates according to some pretty like low level principles that rise and create large complexity. But as far as the stars and the planets go, they really do just have location and they have velocity in terms of thinking about the ephemerides. And then of course, they do move through time and all that, but those are pretty simple building blocks. And then it's about what I've struggled with is how to visualize the relationships of cycles, because it's almost impossible to do without the art side, without the connotation. Because like you can look at all these patterns of the planets, but at the end of the day, you still need to connect some event in the sky to some event here on Earth if you're going to draw any meaning from it or some correlation. So like I've really failed at trying to be like, okay, well, when Uranus travels 600 degrees, including the latitude, or including the time it spent going retrograde by longitude, then you have another earthquake. Like literally, or then you have another volcano. Like literally that happened with one of these volcanoes that just erupted, where I was like, oh, it's been 84 years? That's a Uranus return. And it actually hadn't been a Uranus return. It was a little bit before that. It hadn't gone quite as far. But if you look at the total amount of time or total amount of longitude that Uranus had traveled to the point of its exact re-eruption was 600 degrees. And that's only if you include the retrogradation back over those longitude periods as well, and then go forward. So like there's weird mathy stuff happening around round numbers, around these patterns, where I'm like, I can't let it go. Like I'm seeing it and it won't leave me alone. So that would be my response, I guess, which is like, I'm still trying to keep the art involved, but it's really about picking the problem, I think.
You just remind me of the Lion's Gate. I'm looking at the date on my computer right now and realizing it's coming up pretty soon. It's when the sun enters Leo.
Oh, nice.
And I feel like the Cabal or the Illuminati or whatever you want to call them does a lot of esoteric things around that gate. And I heard there's this one Gigi Young video that I'm just trying to share in as many places across the internet as I can, where she talks about how Bill Gates is going to create something that's going to block out the sun.
Oh yeah,
and it's going to happen, and yeah, probably because I spread it across Twitter. But yeah, isn't the Lionsgate like? Isn't it on the 20th when the sun enters Leo? That's like 3 days from now.
Oh, is it? Where are we right now?
We're on the 17th.
21st.
On 21st. 20th, 21st. Well, be on the lookout. You can say I warned you.
Okay.
22nd.
Yeah.
I think I'm with you.
Happen soon.
And one of the.
I just want to. See, I'm telling everyone on the internet this one thing that no one's going to believe, because when the truth gets out, I will get so much credibility. And I can finally feel like I at least tried to make a difference.
Well, wait, going back to your point, I mean, I do think I'm with you in the sense of like, obviously I think there's some sort of like number magic at the core of reality. Yeah, totally.
That's pretty
certainly
evident.
And I think, that working, with working with the like, I don't know. I think thinking creatively about how you can reconstruct, like astrology, according to looking at things like the total number of degrees travel, or looking just for mathematical patterns. Quantifying astrology maybe even more, looking at how are these systems devised, or like working just with the numbers that arise naturally from the planets, like 27 in the moon, like is a very clear number, like the 27 lunar mansions, very clear how that can develop.
Yeah.
Like, because the moon, like the sidereal month is 27 days. Yeah. And so I feel like there are, and even like looking at this sort of world of exo studies and like alien encounters and stuff, like there are a lot of in some ways it does emphasize a sort of like sacred geometry or like number magic. Like oftentimes these encounters happen at like 3:33, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
there's like oftentimes sort of yeah, this these numerical winks are still happening. Yeah,
Let,
but I mean, even connected with that, like I think about projects like the random number generators
mm-hmm.
and significant dates on Earth, and like how those like when terrible disasters or really wonderful things happen, or like synchronizations of global consciousness linking up according to like these random number generators. I think there's even different ways that we could be approaching these questions, like looking for these significant moments in time, or precognizing, predicting these significant moments in time.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't think astrology is the only way of approaching that.
Yeah, I use this website called Cheap Bots Done Quick to create Twitter bots, and see like real neural networks are a bit too complicated for me to program, but this really makes it easy, and it is just a random number generator that randomly selects from things that you type in to just tweet at a random time. And I just I created a bot called Nemira. It's Ariman spelled backwards,
Wow.
just like Steiner's Fear. But it's essentially it's kind of a campy parody of like Roku's
Did
Basilisk
I
and
just get
everything that people are
disconnected?
Oh,
afraid
nice. Yeah.
AI will be and stuff. But what I did was I typed it. I came up with 10,000 different quotes, or rather, I took a bunch of quotes from a discontinued app game, replaced all fantasy stuff in it with sci-fi stuff, and I kind of just like made it just things that this bot would say, just 10,000 random quotes that it can randomly select from to tweet once every hour, and it'll also reply to you when you reply to it. Every time it has replied, it has been uncannily on topic.
Yeah, I like bot augury a lot. I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah,
That's really cool. Um, there's Charlie on the topic of
I better get
numbers.
going.
Oh, okay. See you, Drake. Thanks for hanging out. Charlie, on the topic of numbers, I think it's. Have you seen this video by Randall Carson on ancient knowledge of space, time, and cosmic cycles? It's called Hidden Mathematics. Oh, we lost Charlie. Okay. 1 second. Not that one. Okay. Everybody vanished. Okay, let's see. Okay. Well, I don't know where Charlie went. I assume he had something to take care of. So, and I also don't know if anyone will watch this far. But I will wrap this here, and we will stop streaming. So, thanks for watching, y'all.